I'll just kick things off briefly. I'm Gaby Goldstein. I'm one of our co-founders here at Sister District, and I'm really thrilled to be here tonight in partnership with 24 different national and local grassroots organizations and groups to have this fireside chat with journalist and author Ari Berman to talk about his really incredible new book, Minority Rule, which I finished just the other night. So in terms of agenda, I'm going to share a few words about Sister District just to orient folks and a few framing thoughts about the book, then introduce Ari and we'll dive right in. A couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this chat, and we will host the link in the video on our website. We may have time for Q&A depending on how things go. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A function. My apologies if things run long and we aren't able to get to all of your questions. There are closed captions available. We'll post the instructions in the chat. So, as I mentioned, I'm co-founder at Sister District, where our mission is to build progressive power in state legislatures. We started this organization 8 years ago, if you can believe it, because we saw a gap in organizing capacity and resources going specifically to building power at this level of government. At least on our side, progressives, I always say, tardy to the party when it comes to paying attention to states. Conservatives have just been so masterful at systematically building power at all levels of government, including at the state level. And of course, these are such important venues of power. We will hear in our conversation with Ari, certainly when it comes to voting rights and election administration, these are increasingly creatures of state law. But of course, from all the policies that we care about, from abortion access to what our kids can't and can't learn at school, these are issues of state policy. And incredibly, yesterday marked the 59th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And this is just such an important time and such a special time to gather and learn from Ari about what he charts in this book, a long-standing right-wing attack on voting rights and democracy, as well as to celebrate the fighters, which is another theme in Ari's book, the fighters who have been with us since the beginning, since the founding of the country, and remain with us today, fighting for our rights and for our democracy. So really thrilled to be here with Ari, who is Mother Jones's national voting rights correspondent. He's the author, of course, of this new book, Minority Rule, as well as Give Us the Ballot, which is another wonderful book. We hosted Fireside Chat, which feels like a lifetime ago. Was it maybe 2018, Ari? I don't know, but a few years ago. So really, really delighted to be together. So just a few thoughts to frame out the book before we dive into conversation. I think personally, having really enjoyed this book, that it really does a great job of showing us big picture and then examples of ways, going back to the founding, ways that anti-democratic features have been baked into our government systems, and ways in which the elite have exploited those features for their own gain to the exclusion of the rest of us. And we'll talk about that going from the founding of the country all the way up to the last 5 or 6 years in a few key places, including Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and all the rest, in the ways in which Trump's allies are really, holding on to a long legacy of anti-democratic ideology and behavior and tactics that really, go right back to the founding. So, it brings up these broad themes from our nation's history. Like, what is government for? Is it for the many? Is it for the few? Was this country ever meant to be a democracy? And should we even care if they wanted it to be a democracy? We want it to be a democracy now, so who cares if they didn't? These are the kinds of questions that that this book grapples with at a big picture level, and then really gets into the specifics about how it all plays out and affects our lives. So, but the last thing I'd say is the book is really hopeful too. As I mentioned, highlighting the ways that folks have fought back, and we continue to fight back. And that too is part of this longer arc of history, is the legacy of progress and the fights and the backlash, yes, but then the progress again and the fights again. So really important, I think, to remember that there is so much hope. And in this moment of enthusiasm, we've got a great ticket going. It's really, really useful, I think, in that moment to remember that legacy too of the hope and the fight, because we're in it. So let's dive in. Ari, the first thing I want to talk about, this tension between, are we a democracy? Are we a republic? Who cares what the founders wanted? But I think in this Zoom room, this may sound kind of crazy, but there is actually a very long-standing, very legitimate tension between whether this country was ever meant to be a democracy or not, right? And it sounds crazy. You mentioned Pat Buchanan in his presidential campaign saying the founding fathers didn't even believe in democracy. And that may sound shocking, but it's true. I mean, we're taught maybe a sort of narrow positive tale about the founding fathers and this whole campfire tale. And we tend to be very derisive as progressives about, thinking the idea that, we're not a democracy. But the reality is that many features of our government are, in fact, they were designed to be anti-democratic. And so it might surprise folks to learn that almost none of the founders, maybe just one, Wilson, I don't know, were actually wanted the United States to be a democracy. So tell us about this. Tell us about this tension and how this thread, this anti-democratic thread, shows up today.
Well, good evening, Gabby, and thank you to so many people who are on this call from all over the country. As you could probably see, I have a huge school map right behind me. Like the governor of Minnesota, I am very into maps, and so it's very cool to see so many people from so many different places on this call at this exciting and hopefully slightly less terrifying moment in American history. And thank you so much to Sister District for hosting this, and all of the groups that are on this call. And thank you to everyone for all your hard work for many years on these important issues. So, Gabby, I really started with a current problem, which was the rise of Donald Trump and the elite conservative white minority that supports him. And I wanted to answer the question, how did we get here? Because that's the question that people kept asking me as a journalist. And that's the question that I kept asking myself. And I wanted to show how the crisis facing American democracy was much older and deeper than Donald Trump. That yes, Trump is certainly an accelerant to the democratic crisis we face, but he's also a product of a broken political system that allowed Trumpism to thrive in the first place. And to do that, I had to go all the way back to the founding of the country. And as you say, we have this view of the founders as these kind of geniuses in white wigs. They're now rapping, of course, in the contemporary play of them. But the fact is, there was this tension from the beginning between the rhetoric in the Declaration of Independence and the whole idea of the revolution, which said that democracy is based on the consent of the governed, and that all men are created equal. Leave aside that women weren't in there, but all men are created equal. And the realities of the governing structures that were created when the founders ratified the Constitution 11 years later, which is that they were concerned with protecting the interests of themselves. And they realized that they were a very distinct minority. They were an elite white male, property holding, in many ways slave holding minority, and they were afraid of the power of a majority of Americans, of poor white men, women, African Americans, Native Americans, that if those people gained power, there would be more demands for things like equality, and that would threaten the interests of the founders. And so when they created these democratic institutions, the fundamental contradiction was that these institutions were actually intended to make the country less democratic. So they created an electoral college because they didn't want Americans to directly elect the president, because they didn't trust the American people. And also many of the slaveholders felt like their power would be undermined by a free vote. They created a US Senate where each state got the same level of representation, so that smaller, more rural, more conservative states had dramatically more power than larger, more urban, more progressive states. They created a 3/5 compromise in the House, so that slave interests would have a lot more power when it came to the US House and also when it came to picking the next president, because the next president was a direct product of slaveholders having more power in the House, rural, smaller states having more power in the Senate, and then, of course, those same institutions then selected the Supreme Court, right? So then you start to see this was all built in to our governing structures. And what's really interesting is, as you mentioned, there has been this push and pull, right? The system has changed a lot. We have a situation in which a lot of people who couldn't vote back in 1787 can vote now. We've reformed situations like the fact that US senators weren't elected, right? Or the 3/5 clause existed in the House. Things like that have changed, right? We've passed the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment to try to make the promise of equality more real. We've passed the Voting Rights Act and other laws to create a multiracial democracy. But our system is more antiquated than people believe. We still have the Electoral College. We still have 2 senators per state, regardless of population. We still have vestiges of Jim Crow built into our governing system. And that's what I want people to understand, that to fix the current problem, we also have to fix the problem that date back to 230 years as well.
Yeah, and as you point out, these anti-democratic features that are baked right in, which as you go through in your history, were compromises that the North made to just get the South to join, right? Like these were all compromises to begin with, but those anti-democratic features are now, we're seeing the exploitation of that in a bigger, more coordinated way than potentially ever before. And I think Wisconsin is a great place to sort of zone in on how some of those tensions have been manifested and are continuing to manifest. Although now we have a Supreme Court in Wisconsin that with Judge Janet that is a pro-democracy majority. But Wisconsin is this tremendous progressive from a historical perspective, this bastion of progressive history, right? Really paved the way during the progressive era for so many pieces of legislation that went on to be national legislation. But also now we have this network of conservative interests that really has used the state as a petri dish for its own regressive policies. And we really saw that come to bear in the 2000s. And would love to hear what happened in Wisconsin in the 2000s and how that was a microcosm for this network, including the dark money groups, Koch and Bradley Foundation, et cetera. The policy think tanks, right-wing policy think tanks, building power in the courts, gerrymandering, all of that comes to bear in Wisconsin in this really clear way. And so how is that a microcosm for what we're seeing nationally and what we saw nationally after that, and what happened there?
That's right, Gabby. So the argument that I make in the book is that there are these long-standing democratic inequities, but then there's this newer anti-democratic movement that really begins to accelerate after Barack Obama's election, the election of the first Black president. And it's afraid of the changing demographics of the country and the US eventually becoming a majority minority nation in which white people are no longer the majority. And what Republicans do is they focus their efforts first on the states. And they say, we're going to turn the states from becoming known as laboratories of democracy. That was the famous phrase made by Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. And we're going to turn them basically into laboratories of oligarchy. And Wisconsin was so notable because it was a state that was known for a place where government was supposed to benefit the many rather than the few. There was this whole idea of called the Wisconsin idea. And Wisconsin gave rise to things like collective bargaining rights for unions and the first programs for Social Security, unemployment insurance, things like that. But instead, what happened is after Republicans took over in Wisconsin in 2010, and they did this in many states, not just Wisconsin, but it was particularly notable in Wisconsin, what happened is they changed the role of government to helping the few rather than the many. And they transformed democratic institutions from being basically democratic to anti-democratic. And they went systematically. They took away labor rights to defang the biggest supporter of the Democratic Party and progressive causes. That, of course, was the huge protest that led in Madison. Then they made it harder to vote, which was something that was replicated all over the country to make it harder for Democratic constituencies to cast a ballot. They did extreme gerrymandering behind closed doors. So even when they passed all these unpopular policies, you couldn't vote them out of office. They went to the courts and poured a ton of dark money into stacking the courts so they would uphold this regressive and unpopular agenda. And it was backed up by a tremendous amount of dark secret money, which benefited from the Supreme Court Citizens United decision. And what I argue is that this then laid the groundwork for Donald Trump. Because even though someone like Scott Walker and someone like Donald Trump were very different, what happened is the Republican Party began radicalizing against democracy at the state level. And once they radicalized against democracy at the state level, that created an opening for someone like Trump. Because if you weren't already radicalized against democracy, why would you support someone like Trump in the first place? So I believe this is a really important untold story. It's obviously been told a lot, but I don't think it's fully sunk in that it wasn't like it was Trump to the states. It was the states to Trump in terms of how the anti-democratic takeover of American politics in so many places occurred.
Ari, you're speaking my language because you're talking about the importance of states, right? And this is our whole mission at Sister District is we also think this is an overlooked story, is that there is a huge amount of power in states that conservatives have harnessed and liberals or progressives have not. And so my follow-up there is, you have a line about how, so when Governor Walker was being recalled, it took an outsized national significance, took on national significance because conservative groups were trying to export Walker's agenda across the country, right? And so this reminded me of political scientist Alex Hurdle Fernandez and Yale Law School Dean Heather Gerken, who have both really looked at how the parties, the two main parties, are increasingly pushing a national vision for the future through our states. But as Heather points out, the idea that, the Brandeis quote about there being laboratories of democracy, it's a campfire tale. There aren't 50 laboratories of democracy. There are two. One is red and one is blue. And the red one is winning because there's more money, there's more focus, there's more success. And so I'm curious for your thoughts about that. I mean, Wisconsin is a case study here. You mentioned in the book several ways in which liberals and Democrats were outspent vastly. The infrastructure on the right was just ready for this moment in Wisconsin. I'm curious for your thoughts here in terms of the money and infrastructure differential on the right and the left. We see that clearly in Wisconsin and we see that elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the major consequences of the 2008 election, is that Democrats became very focused on what was happening in Washington. And with obvious reasons, they had a giant trifecta there. And so they were focused on passing things in Washington. And they took their eye off what was happening in the states because Democrats controlled a lot of the states and they just figured like we're going to be in control of these places for a very long time. And Republicans focused on the state level as a way to nullify the election in many ways of the first Black president. And so they poured all the money into these places. They got very lucky in that 2010 was a wave election, and it was a wave election that coincided with redistricting afterwards, meaning they were in the position to draw the maps in all of these places, like Wisconsin and North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Ohio. And that radically changed state politics, because what happened is they transformed 50-50 states into states that had these incredibly lopsided Republican majorities. And even then, when those states would vote for Obama again in 2012, they would vote in crazy numbers for Republicans in the state legislature, not because they liked Republicans, but because the election results were baked in, basically. That the famous stat I give is that in 2018, Democrats got 54% of the vote for the state legislature in Wisconsin, but Republicans got 64% of seats. I mean, that's impossible without gerrymandering. So it wasn't the only tactic, but it was the key one. The fascinating thing is that you can see this push and pull between anti-democratic and democratic forces that goes all the way back to the founding right now, because of course, Wisconsin has changed a lot and Michigan has changed a lot, and a lot of states have moved in a more progressive direction. I think one of the most important things that happened in the Trump era is Democrats and progressives rediscovered the power of the states. And it was the inverse of the Obama years. They said, we don't control the states. What can we do to fight for our fundamental rights? And they realized, actually, state offices have a lot of power. And even if they're gerrymandered, states don't have an electoral college. States don't have a US Senate where each state gets the same level of representation. States are responsive to majority rule in ways that in many ways the federal government is not. And so you can elect a Democratic governor in Wisconsin. Then you can elect over a series of elections a Democratic majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And then that can strike down the gerrymandered maps. And therefore, the Republican legislature will have to pass the Democratic governor's maps, which was inconceivable. So now for the first time in 15 years, there's going to be competitive elections at the state legislative level in Wisconsin, which is a huge development for democracy. And of course, this is not the only place this is happening. I talk about Michigan in the book, a state that was just as gerrymandered as Wisconsin. But citizens passed initiatives on things like getting rid of partisan gerrymandering, which was transformative for the politics there. And so I think this is really, really important because, like you guys, I think the states have a tremendous amount of power. And I think states tend to be tremendously overlooked. And I think individuals have power to change what happens in the states in ways that's very difficult on the federal level.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would argue perhaps that this differential in infrastructure started long before 2008. I mean, so many of the institutions that you talk about on the right, ALEC and Heritage and all the rest, they date back many decades before. And you know, we're very tardy to the party in starting to develop infrastructure, both on the money side, on the policy side, on the boots on the ground side when it comes to building state power. And so, and why I think in part to the point of this book, there is a real ideological grounding about states on the conservative side that goes right back to the founding. And we don't have that on our side. We don't have a deep emotional connection or ideological connection to state power in a way that they do. And so I think we see that over the hundreds of years, over the centuries. And I completely agree with you. Things are turning around. We are turning this ship around when it comes to building state power, progressive state power. So talking a little bit about the courts, you know, you have a really great chapter about the courts being the most dangerous branch. You know, I think that progressives tend to have a very ahistorical, nostalgic vision of the Supreme Court as a protector of our rights and freedoms. But really, what we really mean there is the Warren Court, and that was a blip on the screen in our nation's history when it comes to the Supreme Court. Really, as you point out, you know, the Supreme Court has largely over the lifetime of our country not been on the side of the vulnerable, but been really in the court for the privileged few. And so, you know, the Federalist Society and all the rest came from this backlash to the rights revolution in that blip of time during the Warren Court, that really brief moment. And of course, now we see the backlash still to this day. And, you know, now we have this revanchist Supreme Court supermajority. Can you tell us a little bit how the courts fit in, how they are an arrow in the conservative quiver, going back in time and also today?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important point that you make, because I think the courts have been arguably the most important driver of minority rule within the conservative movement and the Republican Party, because basically the Republican Party and the conservative movement have looked to the courts to do all the unpopular things that they wouldn't be able to do through the normal democratic process. You are never going to gut the Voting Rights Act or overturn Roe v. Wade or overturn common sense gun laws supported by 90% of Americans through the normal political process, right? So what you do is, the first problem with the courts is, particularly the Supreme Court, is the structure of them. They are the result of two undemocratic institutions: the undemocratic way in which we elect presidents and the undemocratic way that we elect senators. And I'm going to keep talking about this because this is a fatal flaw in American democracy. The structure of these institutions leads to an undemocratic structure. Then, of course, that those undemocratic institutions have been weaponized by Mitch McConnell and others for a very specific purpose. So you have a situation where the court's always been undemocratic. It's often been against progressive values, but it's gotten worse. And so for the first time in US history, 5 of 6 conservative justices were appointed by Republican presidents who lost the popular vote initially and confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans, meaning that as the Electoral College becomes more skewed, as the Senate becomes more skewed, the Supreme Court becomes more skewed. Then they've used the Supreme Court to do a lot of things that are undemocratic, gutting the Voting Rights Act, upholding partisan gerrymandering, Citizens United, et cetera, et cetera. They've used the courts to do a lot of things that are at odds with public opinion, overturning Roe v. Wade, all the things they're doing on gun control, environmental protection, student loans, things like that. And then I think most recently, the most disturbing part of the court is that they have not only given the president king-like power, they have given themselves king-like power to basically act like they are above the law. And that's why I was so heartened to hear President Biden talk about Supreme Court reform. I believe this is too little too late. I believe he should have talked about this much sooner. I believe he should have talked about it much more forcefully when he was in office. I believe Democrats could and should be doing a lot more right now to use, for example, the power of the purse that they control, the ability to hold hearings. But it's so important that this is now within the mainstream, at least of one political party. This is now in the mainstream. We're not going back to a point where Democrats aren't talking about Supreme Court reform. Supreme Court reform is now the position of the Democratic Party leadership. And now the question is, what are you going to do about it, right? And my feeling is, if Democrats think that they can get back in control of Washington, but leave a 6-3 conservative supermajority intact, that supermajority is just going to run rampant over whatever the progressive agenda is. And this just underscores the importance of the states, right? Because one of the things the Supreme Court has done is they have devolved and given a ton of power to the states. And yes, in many ways, that is going to lead to conservative outcomes, abortion bans in places like Florida and Alabama and all these other places. But it's also going to lead to more progressive outcomes, right? Because progressives have an opening now to protect abortion rights, to protect voting rights, to protect so many other fundamental rights at the state level that the Supreme Court might not have greenlit before. And so I think on the one hand, something has to be done about the structure of the Supreme Court, but I also think that people need to say, if we have an opening from the court, we need to take advantage of it while we can. And so I think paradoxically, the Supreme Court has given progressives an opening at the state level that they might not have wanted, but they actually do have right now.
1,000,000%. You know, it's one of the enduring themes of conservative jurisprudence that the goal is to narrow federal protections and enlarge state power. That is a core piece of the vision of the Federalist Society and others. And part of that, well, I should say, now we're starting to understand that there is a desire for a strong unitary executive. So they're all for federal power when it's related to their king. But when it comes to protective measures like civil rights and civil liberties, they're all for devolution. And just one piece of that I think folks may not be following, but I'm following very closely because I'm a regulatory lawyer, is this last Supreme Court session, they have done away with a court decision from 40 years ago called Chevron, which really gave federal agencies like EPA and FDA and all of those protective agencies a lot of ability to fill in the details when Congress passes a statute that's very broad. It's been up to the agencies to figure out how much, PFAS is okay in the water, how much fire retardant standards should a baby's clothes have. That now has been eliminated. And what it means in part is that states are going to have more authority, more ability, I would say, and obligation to regulate in these protective areas. And so, Ari, I completely agree with you. It's an opportunity and a challenge for states depending on their political climate. But absolutely, the court is engaged in this long-term process of devolving rights to the states, at least this court. And I have to agree. I mean, it's absolutely incredible how quickly court reform has taken center stage as a main, as sort of just a matter of course for the Democratic Party. I think it's absolutely incredible. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like it. So let's zoom in on November 2020 and talk a little bit about the anti-democratic tactics that this cast of the comic book villain cast of characters in the book, right? You've got Kobach, you've got Hoffler, you've got Eastman, you've got Cleta Mitchell, you've got Heritage Foundation and ALEC. They all came together to achieve this goal of marginalizing political power of non-white people and non-elites, and entrench their own power after this 2020 election. And in particular, I'd love if you talk a little bit about how prominently state legislatures were used as tools in this moment, right? We have Republican legislators using their investigatory powers to investigate fraud. We've got Trump lobbying Republican legislators to override the popular vote and install their, appoint their own electors. We've got the independent state legislature doctrine and theory, not doctrine, pardon me, that Eastman and Mitchell and others kind of cooked up and tried to tee up. Tell us what happened there and how the tactics that Trump and his allies used, including using state legislatures, were extensions of these anti-democratic tactics that go back, hundreds of years.
Well, that's right. I mean, they were kind of throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. And so first they started filing lawsuits, and the courts quickly threw out these lawsuits to try to overturn the election. And then they started focusing on the states and the fact that so many key swing states had Republican controlled legislatures in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Georgia. And so they tried to get these states to overturn the election. And they weren't able to, but it wasn't for lack of trying, right? And they weren't able to because it was illegal in these places to overturn the will of their state's voters and to just do it after the fact. But I think it shined a spotlight on the power that state legislatures have, right? Because nobody thought about who is in control, who is the legislative leader in all of these places. Nobody could name these people, but actually they had a tremendous amount of power, and they were elected with very few votes. I mean, you're talking about some state legislative districts, you could have 15,000, 20,000 people electing someone who could be the chair of the Georgia House, right? And then they have a tremendous amount of power. And then what happened after that is state legislatures began weaponizing the insurrection through other means. So they try to overturn the election, they fail. Then the first thing they do after January 6th is they go back to the states and they say, okay, let's try to couldn't overturn the election. Let's try to figure out how to make it harder for Democratic constituencies to be able to vote. So they changed the voting laws in all these places, Georgia, Florida, et cetera, et cetera. They change who's in charge of running and certifying elections. This happens at a formal level in some places. In Georgia, for example, they restructured the State Board of Election. We just saw this State Board of Election there this week say that you need to have a quote unquote reasonable inquiry before certifying an election, which is just a total invitation to not certify an election based on essentially nothing. And in some cases, it's taking over county clerk positions, becoming poll watchers, doing all those kind of things. We've already seen counties in Georgia, counties in Nevada, counties in Arizona not certify elections. And so the thing that really worries me here, and I think where we have to be really vigilant, is when I started covering the issue of voting rights more than a decade ago, the thing you were really concerned about was voter suppression on the front end, efforts to make it harder to vote. Now, I'm concerned not just about voter suppression on the front end, but voter suppression on the back end. And which means trying to overturn results and not certifying elections. Voter suppression on the front end can prevent people from voting, I would say, largely on the margins, right? It can affect a lot of people, but it's not going to affect 90% of voters, probably. Voter suppression on the back end, if you just don't certify the votes, you could throw out millions of votes. I mean, Donald Trump was asking the Supreme Court to throw out 10 million votes when he challenged the election results in 5 states. So it's concerning to me that basically your desire to overturn an election has become a litmus test of whether you can succeed in the Republican Party, right? I mean, J.D. Vance was chosen because he was the most vocal election denier of the VP picks. And so that to me underscores the need for a stronger pro-democracy movement to be aware of all of these things. And I think one of the things that happened in 2020 that was really heartening was people signed up to be poll workers and people signed up to be poll watchers and do all these kind of things. And I feel like a lot of people sort of felt like I did it in 2020, I'm kind of burnt out, I don't know if I want to do it anymore. And the MAGA people have filled the void. And so I think there's a lot more MAGA people involved in the election process than before. Even at the Georgia State Board of Election, it was largely MAGA people that were at that meeting. And so what is the other side doing? Because I think that there's a very clear pro-democracy majority in this country. We see it over and over when it comes to things like, do you support voting rights reform? Do you support banning gerrymandering? Do you support free and fair elections? It's very clear there's a pro-democracy majority in this country. The problem to me is that the anti-democracy minority often seems more engaged on these issues and more willing to try to rig the election than the other side is to protect that election. And so I hope people don't become complacent and say they failed to overturn the election in 2020. A lot of high-profile election deniers lost in 2022 in key states like Wisconsin and Arizona, Pennsylvania. That means it can't happen in 2024. I would argue the election denier movement is a lot stronger and more organized in 2024 than it was in 2020 or 2022.
Yeah, we recently held a scenario planning session with some partners and state lawmakers to talk about this exact thing. What has changed since 2020? And what's different now, and what are state lawmakers looking for? What are they worried about? What are they seeing? And it's exactly what you've pointed to, Ari, which is that the coup 1.0 was trying to fix the votes after the fact, right? And the pivot has been to changing the laws so that it's not illegal to do the sorts of changes after the fact or modify the election or and engineer outcomes. It's not going to be their goal is for it to not be illegal. And the mechanism of ensuring that is working through state legislatures to pass the laws that give themselves more power to change, to certify or to challenge elections. And that's absolutely been the case in a place like Georgia, where, as you mentioned, they expanded, the Georgia legislature expanded its authority over certification. And just yesterday, I think the election board voted to pass a rule making it easier for officials to delay certification of results. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but completely agree that this pivot has been the main thing we heard from state lawmakers when we talked to them about this, is that the main thing that's changed from 2020 is they've now had 4 years to get their legal ducks in a row, and they've passed a lot of laws that will make the behavior that fail. The reason why it failed in 2020 was that it was illegal, but it's not illegal anymore. Now it's legal to do the things that they couldn't do then. And that's the thing that's very, very scary and very much controlled by state legislatures in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that on the flip side, some things have also improved. I mean, the fact that Congress passed the Electoral Count Act, I think they should have done a lot more when it came to voting rights, but that does make it harder for the state legislatures to try to steal an election. It sets much clear authority in terms of what power states do and don't have and what power Congress does and doesn't have. I also think if you look at the states, one of the consequences of 2022 was there's a divided legislature now in Pennsylvania. There's a Democratic legislature in Michigan. There's a Democratic governor in Arizona. There's things that exist now in terms of state governments that didn't exist in 2020. So on the one hand, the Republican Party is more radical and organized than it was before. On the other hand, the situation in the states is much better. If they want to try to steal an election, they're going to have a harder time doing it through state legislatures in the key battleground states. I'm not saying they can't do it or they won't try, but I think it will be harder. And so I think that those kind of gains that have been made in 2022 in the last midterm were critically important in terms of setting up a better playing field in 2024. It's also important to note that Trump controlled the Justice Department in 2020. He won't control the Justice Department anymore. He had the full power of the federal government in a way that he doesn't now. So I think that some of the things that he used to his advantage in the run up to January 6th and on January 6th, he doesn't have that power anymore. But I think that people have to keep getting involved at the local level, at the level of poll workers, poll watchers, county clerks. It can't just be MAGA people taking these jobs and going to these meetings, because that's what I'm seeing in a lot of places, that they feel like they were robbed and they feel like something was stolen from them, whether they believe it or not, or it's not true. I think a lot of them believe it regardless. Some of them don't believe it and are just exploiting it for political purposes, but they feel wronged and they are very organized, going county by county, state by state at the hyper local level, well beyond state legislatures. And then they're even pushing state legislatures to the right to continually pass things. I mean, Georgia didn't just pass one voter suppression law in 2021. They kept passing more bad bills because they kept getting more and more pressure from election deniers. So I think the broader pro-democracy movement needs to stay organized on this and realize that the presidential election is not just going to be decided by who votes in these states, but who controls the election machinery. And that part of it, I think, is still not getting enough attention.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I want to talk about ICRA in a minute. But let's also talk about another federal piece of legislation that we desperately needed and didn't happen, which is the attempts that Warnock and others made to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and take what happened in Shelby County and those decisions and really put the meat back on the bones of the VRA. You tell a really compelling story about how close Democrats got and what happened there and how those efforts failed. So would love to hear a little bit about why we couldn't get that done and what happens next about that.
Well, I think this was the biggest missed opportunity of the first 2 years of Biden's presidency, not passing federal legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act and to have federal standards for voting. I think that the 2024 election, not just on the presidential level, but on the local level, would be a lot more fair if we had that. It would be a lot harder for states to gerrymander. It would be a lot harder for them to subvert election outcomes. It would be a lot harder for them to pass new voter suppression laws if these measures had been in effect. And I think a lot of people argued this was a once in a lifetime movement to do it. And they weren't able to, and they weren't able to basically because of two Democratic senators who are no longer Democrats, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. And then on the one hand, it was remarkable that you basically had 48 Senate Democrats support filibuster reform, which at the beginning of this process, there was no way there was 48 Democratic senators. At the same time, the president was slow to make this an issue. The Democratic leadership was slow to make this a big issue. They did not respond to the urgency I believe they needed to. I think once Donald Trump tried to overturn the election, protecting American democracy needed to be the overriding goal, and it wasn't often. It was about bringing back normalcy to America, and I think that's extremely important. But if you bring back normalcy and one side still is going to rig the entire process, then things are not going to be normal. I think it was a misreading, and I think it failed to stop the radicalization of the right. Now, what I will say is I think that if there is a Democratic trifecta again in Washington, and that possibility is now not so hard to imagine, if there is a new Democratic trifecta in Washington, I think you will have 50 votes to change the filibuster to pass voting rights legislation. And I think it will be a major Democratic priority. And I believe that the Democratic leadership on the ticket is very committed to this. Kamala Harris worked on this issue. She was the point person on voting rights legislation. This is obviously very important to her. Governor Tim Walz in Minnesota had a very strong record on voting rights, working with the Democratic legislature. They passed the Minnesota Voting Rights Act, their own version of a Voting Rights Act. They passed policies like automatic registration, early voting, restoring voting rights to 50,000 people with past felony convictions, things like that. Minnesota has routinely ranked #1 in the country in voter turnout. So I think this is the most pro-voting rights ticket ever. And I think we just have to keep pushing to make this a really big issue and to make federal voting rights reform a big deal, because my view reporting on this is that the Voting Rights Act is what made America a truly multiracial democracy and brought so many people who were shut out of the process in. And as long as it's weakened and as long as there aren't federal safeguards, we're not going to be able to live up to our democratic commitments.
I totally agree. And I share your optimism for a new Congress and the new opportunities that a new Congress would provide. I do want to mention, I want to go back to ICRA for a minute, because I don't know if folks followed this so much. It might have seemed a little bit technical as it was going through Congress, but essentially there was an update to the Electoral Count Act. And Ari, you talked about this a little bit. Because Trump tried to exploit ambiguities in the Electoral Count Act after 2020, we were able, in a bipartisan way, to pass federal legislation to update that, to, as you say, make some changes. I'm personally rather concerned that there are a number of ambiguities that that this legislation continues to have that could be very problematic for us this year. In particular, there's an ambiguity about what happens. There's a requirement. So just so folks know, there's a requirement now that states certify by a particular date, but it's not at all clear what happens if they don't. And I think it's very, very obvious that a number of states are just going to blow the deadline. Why not? There's no penalty. And it's very unclear. I guess it goes to the federal courts. Well, that sounds like, oh, that could be okay for Trump and his allies. So I'm curious. I've heard ICRA kind of called a Band-Aid, or in a different way. Not really. I guess another way that I've heard it referred to, discussed, is like anything that passes bipartisan is pretty toothless. I'd be curious for your thoughts about how much ICRA really gets us in these ambiguities and what we should really expect this year.
Yeah, well, I mean, my understanding of it, and I'm not a lawyer, but I basically, in talking to a lot of law professors and other people about this, was that it was better than what came before, but it isn't strong enough, and that there are still some unknowns here in terms of the process. It lays out things like, I think it would be, for example, it raises the number of people that are needed to object to the results. So you can't just have one senator object to the results anymore. So things like that are pretty concrete that would make it harder to do. It clarifies what the vice president's role is in a way that Trump can't just pressure Mike Pence to overturn the results, because Mike Pence doesn't have that power anymore. When it comes to the states, that's where a lot of the ambiguities are. And that's the thing that I'm concerned about. And of course, that's a lot of the concern about Georgia, because you delay certification, then it gets tied up in court, and then you can have a situation where, what if they go past the deadline at that point? And the courts were overwhelmingly against Donald Trump in terms of 2020. I think in a lot of cases, not because they were against Trump, but they were against the way that Trump did things, which was this kind of ad hoc, after the fact way. My concern is, what if you go through the normal political channels and try to do it that way? Then I think the courts will be a lot more sympathetic to what Trump might be trying to do, just like they were a lot more sympathetic to him in the immunity case than we thought they would be, because he went through the quote unquote normal political channel. So I think it's not enough. I think that's why people need to focus on who's in control of state legislatures, who's in control of the certification of elections. I guarantee you, if you talk to the MAGA people right now, they can tell you who's in charge of the certification of elections in all of these places. And they might not be able to tell you a lot of other things, but they can tell you a lot of this stuff. And I don't think the average Democrat can. I think the average Democrat probably can tell you a lot of facts about things that are happening in America, but I'm not sure they're aware of this is how the certification process works. I think people need to educate themselves, just like there was a lot of voter education in 2020 about how people can vote safely, how votes are counted, how the system works. I think that voter education contributed in a lot of ways to having the highest turnout we've had in 120 years. But I think that once again, we need to have a higher level of understanding of this is how the process works. This is how it's been improved, but these are where the vulnerabilities still are.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree. I am concerned. I am concerned, but hopeful that the safeguards in ICRA in these changes to the Electoral Count Act will at least forestall some of the behavior that we might see. And who knows, we may win in such a landslide this year that none of this will matter all this much. And that is the goal. That is the absolute goal. And I think that's a good transition to talk about the fighters, right? I do think that this book is so hopeful. There's such a careful history, such a thoughtful discussion about the fighters, from Wilson fighting for this to be a democracy in the first place, to John Roy Lynch and his 34 other Black state legislator colleagues in Mississippi elected in 1870 during Reconstruction. Of course, to Stacey Abrams and Raphael Warnock, Katie Fahey fighting gerrymandering in Michigan, all the rest. It's really a story about how the few can rally together and affect change. And I would love to hear about them. Tell us about them and the legacy that they carry, and why that should give us the courage to keep fighting too.
Yeah, I mean that's what I found inspiring about researching the book, is that there was always these people, in spite of incredible odds, who stood up for American democracy and made it better. You talk about, you mentioned one of the people, John Roy Lynch, the first Black Speaker of the House in Mississippi. I mean, he's someone who was a slave in Louisiana and then goes on to become the first Black Speaker of the House in Mississippi, and leads the first integrated body in that time, and is making laws for the country, and then goes on to be a member of Congress at a time in which none of those rights would have applied to him even a decade earlier. And I talk about, in the contemporary time, Katie Fahey in Michigan, an activist who basically woke up one day despondent over the 2016 election, said, I want to take on partisan gerrymandering in Michigan, had no idea how to do it, Googled how do you stop gerrymandering, and created this political movement that led to Michigan having fair maps for the first time in forever, and created an independent citizens commission, which then led to an outcome where, for the first time in over a decade, the number of votes actually equaled the number of seats in Michigan. It just so happened that allowed Democrats to flip the state legislature and then enact all of these progressive policies. But she wasn't doing it because she wanted Democrats to win. She was doing it because she wanted to make the process more fair, which happened. And the thing that I always say, in terms of, because I know we're running out of time, the things that people should do, and I'll just go through a few quick things. I mean, one is, obviously the most important thing is elect pro-democracy candidates. And this doesn't necessarily mean electing Democrats. It means electing pro-democracy candidates. There are pro-democracy Republicans out there. There are also Democrats that are not that committed to democracy. So I think electing pro-democracy candidates, number one. Number two, get involved on the state and local level, and get involved where you can make the most difference. Because I know this, you know this too, Gabby. People always say, I'm in New York, right? People always say that, oh, I'm so mad about voter suppression in Georgia or Wisconsin or North Carolina. I'm going to go to those states. And I'm always like, that's good. You should go to those places if you want to go there. But do you understand that the House of Representatives is probably going to be decided in a handful of districts in New York and California, right? These two very blue states. And so in a lot of ways, change can happen anywhere. And then often people can make the most difference in their own communities. And that the most local races are often where the biggest changes can happen when you're talking about state legislative and other races. And the third thing is we need a long-term movement for structural reform on the federal level. That means figuring out a way to abolish the Electoral College, if not through a constitutional amendment, then through the National Popular Vote Compact. That means statehood for DC. That means Supreme Court reform, and understanding these things are not going to happen overnight. You talked about the right-wing strategy. When they were losing the war of rights in the 1960s, when the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and the Immigration Reform Act and the women's movement were succeeding, they said, we need to have a counter-revolution, and understood that it was going to take decades to do this. And that's not to say it's going to take decades to do these other things, but it starts with making them a priority. And too often, these are the first things that are thrown to the side. And the first thing is, we have to wait to do DC statehood. We have to wait to try to end the Electoral College. We have to wait for Supreme Court reform. If we wait too much longer, we won't have a democracy to protect. So understanding that fundamental reform isn't just about good government, it's about saving American democracy. And then people need to make the links between our broken political system and the broken policies and show that a broken democracy is what leads to dirtier air and dirtier water. It's what leads to mass incarceration. It's what leads to losing the fundamental right to choose. That's what occurs when democracy is broken. So that I hope people make those links. And when people say, you hear people don't care about democracy. People don't care about democracy when it's an abstract issue. When they understand how democracy affects their lives, they care a lot. And that's up to us to make the argument in such a way that it's compelling to people and it makes them feel empowered, as opposed to a sense of existential dread that makes them just want to pull the blankets over their head again.
1,000,000%. Everyone on this Zoom call is a fighter in this long journey that we're on to be free, right? And so we all carry that legacy of resistance and progress, and that's what we're fighting for this year. So thank you all for joining us. Ari, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom with us. I know I'm fired up to do what I can in my corner to help pro-democracy state legislative candidates win in swing states. 63 votes flipped the Pennsylvania House in 2022. Every vote counts at the state ledge level, and pursuing all the reforms that Ari mentioned, I know is on all of our agendas, and we got a lot of work to do. But I don't know about you guys, I'm feeling a lot better than I was last month about our chances. So let's get to work. Let's do the work. And as I say, many hands make the work light. Let's go. Let's win. Thank you, Ari, so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.